Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got a video that's talking about some of the hottest tech choices in some of the most dominant decks that just got finished sweeping two of the bigger events from this past weekend. But it's the last week of the meta, so let's talk about some of these card choices. And what's really fascinating is, if you watched my videos this past week, I actually talked about a lot of these tech choices in one of my videos, and I gave them a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or some of them I kind of gave them like a thumb sideways, kind of like in the middle. But let's talk about these decks, and I'll give you a little bit of background info on how I found some of these decks as well. So this is the winning deck list from the weekend's Ursi Day Pocket Weekly, and keep in mind this continues to be the largest tournament every week that is involved in Pokemon Pocket, and it constantly has at least like 1,300 people. I think this weekend it had somewhere 1,300. Other weekends it's had 1,600, and ironically, like, it's really interesting. This is a whole separate like topic, but like there's been a little bit of a decline in people entering tournaments lately, which is kind of fascinating. Maybe it's because of time zones, maybe it's due to people's feelings about the meta. I don't know. What do you think about that? Actually, I'm kind of curious. I've also noticed that like on Twitch there seems to be a little bit of a lower viewership on some on the pocket like category. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Is that something that is maybe an overreaction? I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. But let's talk about this deck list really quickly. So this is the deck list. I got an image showed, so don't worry. But there's a couple of things that stand out about this list. So shout out to Nino Leo. This might have been the second time that they won Ursi Day's tournament. I don't even know. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. Maybe they topped like top 2 or top 4 before. But this is the deck list, and there's a couple of things that stand out. Right, the first thing that stands out is the 1-1 split in the tools. Right, the one giant cape, the one rocky helmet, and then the other thing that stands out is the double Kangaskhan as opposed to Druddigon. And this is a card that I talked about in my last week's video about, tech cards. And I kind of went set by set and some of the more popular tech cards. And again, like, one of the things that I pointed out in this video, or in that video, was that Kangaskhan is like the more aggressive stall wall card, right? Like, instead of Druddigon being passive, like Kangaskhan is like, hey, let's get a little bit more in your face. And although you may flip double tails, you still have the potential to knock out and execute on your first turn that you can attack, right? So like that's massive. So that's one thing that really stood out. The other thing, again, like I said, that stood out was the Pokemon tool breakdown. But this is your standard Dark Zone deck for for the most part, outside of the Kangaskhan. And Dark Zone, ironically, like swept both of these tournaments that I'm going to be talking about. But there's another deck that I want to talk to you about. So this is Seraru, who got top 8. And if you follow Pokemon Pocket at all, you've probably seen Seraru in the top cuts, or like very close to top cuts. Like, I've never talked to this person at all. I don't know anything about them outside of they play some banger Pokemon Pocket decks. And every week they kind of like bring their own twist to either a completely new deck, or they bring their own twist to a very good meta deck. And this was their twist to Dark Zone, and they ended up doing very well with it. But like another thing that I would probably point out with Seraru is, I'm pretty sure Seraru was one of the first people to play Kangaskhan in Dark Zone as well. But let's check out this deck list. So last week I also talked about Tauros, and like one of the big issues with Tauros is that like there's some matchups where it's just like not great in, like Dark Zone decks. Or excuse me, not Dark Zone decks, but Magnezone. Like Magnezone Fighting Box, like Tauros is pretty like terrible, right? But there's other decks like Exeggutor that, you could get a lot of value out of Tauros in some cases. And so basically what Seraru did in this deck list is said, hey, I'm going to cut one Darkrai, because most of the time one Darkrai is going to be all that I need. And then also, I'm going to play a Tauros to go along with my Kangaskhan as somewhat of an energy sink, right? So I'm either putting energies on my Darkrai, or I'm putting energies on my Tauros, unless I need to like fuel my Kangaskhan for that first turn to get some swings with it. But really fascinating. And again, like Tauros is a card that it's kind of like recognized as the answer to Executor EX, even though like it still can come up short depending on like, did they bring it in? Like, was your Tauros in the active and then they sent in their Executor EX? Because if that's the case, then they might actually outpace you by hitting heads, right? So again, like there's some situations where Tauros is going to put a lot of pressure on Executor EX, and like that's going to be the big thing that it's trying to do. Even when you look at a deck list like this, where you're kind of like, it seems kind of random, right? There's no Dialga, there's no Manaphy. But again, you got like just your typical Dark Zone deck. And then the other thing to point out too is like you can notice, typically I would say Giant Cape is a lot of the time better, but this deck decided to be a little bit more in your face and a lot more aggressive, right? And so that's why you see Rocky Helmet as opposed to Giant Cape, in my opinion. And you've got the traditional like 1/1 split of Cyrus Sabrina, you got the 1 Leaf, and then the 1 Pokemon Communication. So again, really cool deck list. And if you're looking for a player to keep up with, and you're into like just kind of trying out different decks that are not like clickbait YouTube decks, definitely follow what Seraru is playing. Hey, give them a shout out if you end up coming across them. I don't know them at all, like I said. Would love to chat with them. I probably should seek them out at some point, maybe even do like a little interview if I could. But yeah, really good player, amazing deck builder, and pretty cool deck here, even though it's, hey, it's Dark Zone. Like we're pretty used to seeing this deck. So this person is the winner of the PLL tournament from this past weekend. So I'm going to call him Sire, Sire. That sounds cool. But anyway, so Sire, this is another Dark Zone deck. The theme of this weekend is Dark Zone, apparently, right? Dark Zone strikes back. And, even though Executor was the most played decks in both of these tournaments, it didn't necessarily have the success. And, like, you could make the argument that, like, Executor EX, as good as it is, it's still somewhat of a coin flip deck, right? Like you still need to hit heads at crucial times, and like not hitting heads like brings your opponent back into the game a lot of times, right? But anyway, so talking about this Dark Zone deck, let's get the image up here. So just to make sure you can see this, let me make sure I move out of the way. I'm out of the way. So you see that? 2 Rocky Helmets. You see that? Okay, sweet. So again, 2 Rocky Helmets, no Giant Capes. And again, like that's a little bit of a change up compared to the Executor EX decks that are like, yeah, they definitely need to be playing Giant Cape versus Rocky Helmet, like a 2-to-1 split solid. But when you take a look at the rest of this deck, it's pretty standard. There's nothing really that stands out. It's just kind of showing you like there's different flavors to Dark Zone. And this is just like the traditional build, right? This is nothing kind of crazy. But again, congrats to them for winning the PLL tournament. But I'm not done talking about these tech cards. So let's talk a little bit more about them. Now, this is a lot smaller of a tournament, but this is a deck list brought to you by somebody by the name of DM3LO22. And I wanted to point out a couple of things about this deck list that I thought were pretty fascinating. One, obviously the inclusion of Chatot, right? Like Chatot is a card that, again, like I talked about it in my last week's video of tech cards. And like I found, I kind of like said, like it has a hard time finding a home, and it does require you to kind of build your deck around it, where like you're playing cards and that you're basically trying to dump your hand. But then it can get a little bit awkward because you could like shuffle back pieces that you need to evolve. So like it can get a little awkward, but this is a really pretty small tournament when you compare it to some of the other big giant ones. But it's really fascinating to see that like people are still cooking with this card, and you can kind of see the idea, right? The idea is that Chatot helps you find your Greninja line, and then while you're doing that, you're either stalling with Dredagon, you're refilling your hand with Chatot, and then, mid to late game, you're applying pressure with Greninja and Darkrai. And then you've got your Rocky Helmets to dissuade your opponent from doing damage. And then you've got your double Cyrus as opposed to the 1/1 split Sabrina Cyrus. And then 1 Leaf to boot. So this is a little bit of a different deck that we've seen. And then this is obviously not Dark Zone, right? This is Dark Greninja. But again, Darkrai Greninja typically does have some solid play lines that can go into that Dark Zone deck. But again, when your Greninja gets lined up into a Magneton or a Magnezone, it's just kind of like, it feels kind of bad. But again, really cool to see Chatot being a thing. But there's one more deck that I want to show you. This deck was something that I came across in one of the discords that I'm in, and I will tell you a little bit of a background. Basically, there are some other leagues that are doing like team battles with, Pokemon Pocket, and I might have some more news in that area in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. But this is a deck that was played in one of those team battles, and typically these team battles try to keep their deck list like very private until like they play them, because like it's a little bit of an advantage to keep things secret. But I noticed that there was a lot of trends between this deck and the decks that ended up, or one of the deck, or a couple of the decks that did very well in Ursi Day's tournament. So the first thing to point out is the one Darkrai, and then the second thing to point out is the Chatot, right? So this is a really interesting take on trying to use Chatot to replenish your hand while you're still getting time to find your Magnezone line, find your Pokemon tool, or hey, just find cards that you can play to dump your hand, right? And then you're along the way you're doing that, you're either stalling with Druddigon, or again you're using Chatot. And then your mid to late game finisher, which is very similar to that Greninja Chatot Darkrai deck, your mid to late game finishers are your Magnezone and your one Darkrai. And you might be asking, like, why are they only playing one Darkrai? It's because that's typically all that you'll ever need, right? Like I tried to kind of say that in the first deck list that we saw that played one Darkzone or Darkrai. But again, just some different areas that people are trying to address that Executor matchup. And like the other thing that I didn't point out about Chatot when I talked about it with that Greninja list that we just saw is that like Executor EX, that deck, it typically has like big hands, right? It has like 4, 5, 6, 7 card hands, right? So Chatot is trying to punish them for having big hands, but also give you more answers to their Executor EX, right? So instead of playing something like a Mars or a red card, they're basically saying, hey, that's a one-sided card, right? That strictly punishes my opponent. But I'm trying to punish my opponent, but also advance my game state. And I'm willing to sacrifice a potential one prizer with my Chatot in order to do that, right? And even if Chatot does get stuck in the active against Executor EX, they're going to need a heads coin flip, right? Either from Executor EX, or they're going to need 2 heads, typically from the Serebii EX. So again, just kind of breaking down some of these different deck lists. Maybe it's something that you can have some fun with. We still have like 24 hours or so in that 45 wins thing, so if you haven't wrapped that up, maybe you can try these out as well. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into my content. You guys just clicking on the video and watching it, like letting it play, helps out the channel so much. I would love if you would leave a comment and subscribe to the channel, so that way you could see even more of my content, especially as we get closer to hopefully the new mini set. And again, I look forward to seeing you guys in the comments. There's some great comments in my videos. Like, I got to give you guys a huge tip of the cap. Like, seriously, I'm very fortunate. I'm very lucky to have a community of people that chime in and have some really good discussions in the comments as well. So with that being said, I appreciate you so much. And until next time, peace.